December 18, 1944, 02:15 hours. A narrow snow-choked road near La Glaise, Belgium. The air inside Panzer 213 smelled of hot metal, diesel fumes, and the damp wool of 5 nervous men. Lieutenant Franz Wagner, all of 22 years old, pressed his eye socket against the cold steel of his commander's periscope, peering into a world of monochrome shadows. Outside, the Ardennes forest was a labyrinth of skeletal trees draped in heavy snow, the silence absolute and unnerving. But inside his steel behemoth, the silence was a distant memory. The massive Maybach engine just behind the bulkhead idled with a deep, guttural thrum that vibrated through the floor plates and into his bones. It was the sound of immense, barely contained power. This was the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausf. B, the King Tiger, the most powerful tank on Earth. And it was his. In the pocket of his thick winter tunic, a letter from his father, a stoic veteran of the Great War's trenches, felt heavy as a stone. His father didn't write of glory or duty. He wrote of machines. "Be careful of your new Tiger," he had penned. "The finest engine can have a weak heart. The strongest steel can have a flawed soul. Never forget, Franz, that a machine this complex has a will of its own, and it is not always aligned with yours." At the time, Franz had dismissed it as the caution of an old man from an older, simpler war. Now deep behind enemy lines, the words echoed with a chilling prescience. His driver, a boy named Klaus, no older than 18, spoke through the intercom, his voice tight. "Lieutenant, the transmission. It feels stiff. The gears are not seating cleanly." Franz felt a familiar knot of ice form in his stomach. They were the tip of the spear of Kampfgruppe Piper, the driving force of the entire Ardennes offensive. Speed was everything, but his 70-ton monster, designed to be invincible, was already showing signs of a profound internal weakness. The fuel gauge, a needle he watched more than the tactical map, was plummeting with terrifying speed. The ground beneath them, a frozen crust of mud and snow, threatened to give way under their immense weight with every lurch forward. He looked out at the silent, oppressive darkness and felt the crushing weight not just of his tank, but of the entire offensive. They were supposed to be an unstoppable iron fist, but as another gear ground with a sickening protest, Franz began to suspect they were trapped inside their own beautiful, magnificent, and fatally flawed weapon. The King Tiger was the final, terrifying evolution of Germany's tank design philosophy. Since the shocking appearance of the Soviet T-34 in 1941, German engineers had been locked in an arms race, prioritizing firepower and protection above all else. The Tiger, I had been the first answer, a formidable beast that dominated the battlefields of 1943. But the King Tiger, or Tiger II, was intended to be the definitive statement, a weapon so far beyond the capabilities of its adversaries that it would render them obsolete. It was, on paper, the perfect weapon for a nation forced onto the strategic defensive. By 1944, Germany could no longer match the Allies in sheer numbers. The endless streams of Shermans, Cromwells, and T-34s pouring from Allied factories threatened to overwhelm the Wehrmacht through sheer mass. The German solution was qualitative superiority. The King Tiger was designed to be a mobile fortress, an unbreakable anchor for the German lines. It was a weapon built to absorb punishment and destroy the enemy from ranges where it could not be harmed in return. Its specifications were staggering. The hull was fronted by a 150 mm armor plate, sloped back at 50 degrees, giving it an effective thickness of nearly 200 mm. The turret face was a single, immense slab of cast steel 185 mm thick. This sloped armor, a lesson learned from the T-34, was theoretically immune to every anti-tank gun in the Allied arsenal at standard combat ranges. To arm this fortress, Krupp provided the most powerful tank gun of the war, the 8.8 cm Kabuki 43L71, an evolution of the famed anti-aircraft gun. This long-barreled cannon fired a 10-kilogram armor-piercing shell at a velocity of over 1,000 meters per second. It could punch through the front plate of a Sherman from over 2.5 kilometers away, a distance at which the Sherman's own 75mm gun was utterly useless. These technological titans were not issued to regular panzer divisions. They were entrusted to a handful of independent heavy panzer battalions, the Schwer Panzerabteilungen. These were elite veteran units that served as Hitler's fire brigades, rushed to the most critical sectors of the front to halt enemy breakthroughs or spearhead desperate counteroffensives. The plan for the Ardennes offensive was a classic example of this doctrine. A small number of King Tigers, concentrated in the hands of the 1st SS Panzer Division, would shatter the thinly held American lines, their psychological and physical impact creating a breach through which the lighter, more numerous Panther and Panzer IV tanks could pour. The King Tiger was not just a tank, it was a strategic tool, the linchpin of Germany's entire late-war defensive strategy. To be assigned to the crew of a King Tiger was to experience a paradox of invincibility and extreme vulnerability. For a commander like Franz Wagner, the view from his cupola offered a sense of godlike power. He could survey the battlefield, knowing that the steel cocoon around him could shrug off enemy shells that would turn lesser tanks into flaming coffins. The devastating report of his own 88mm gun, followed by the sight of an enemy tank erupting in flames a kilometer away, was a potent affirmation of his tank's supremacy. But this feeling was fleeting, often replaced by a suffocating claustrophobia. The tank's interior was a cramped, intricate world of steel, wiring, and machinery. Every member of the 5-man crew had a brutally demanding job. The loader, often the strongest man in the crew, had to wrestle the enormous 23-kilogram, meter-long 80mm shells in a space where he could barely stand upright. In the heat of battle, this was a physically punishing, exhausting task. The gunner, hunched over his state-of-the-art Turmzielfernrohr 9D optic, had the immense pressure of making every shot count, as ammunition was precious and a missed shot could give an enemy the second they needed to flank them. For the driver, the experience was a constant nerve-wracking battle with the machine itself. He sat isolated in the front, wrestling with 2 large levers that controlled the sophisticated but delicate steering system. Every turn, every gear change in the 70-ton behemoth required immense physical effort and a fine mechanical sympathy. The constant fear was of a breakdown, the sickening lurch of a thrown track, the high-pitched whine of a failing transmission, or the sudden, terrifying silence of a stalled engine were the sounds that haunted a driver's nightmares. The psychological burden on the entire crew was immense. They knew their tank was a priority target for every Allied soldier, from fighter-bomber pilots to bazooka teams. They were slow, enormous, and drew fire like a magnet. While their frontal armor was formidable, their side and rear armor were thinner, their engine deck vulnerable from the air. Every mission was a gamble. And if the tank broke down, a common occurrence, the feeling of power evaporated instantly. Stranded deep in enemy territory, the crew of an immobilized King Tiger was no longer a crew of supermen. They were just 5 soldiers, alone and exposed, trapped in a 70-ton iron tomb. For the Allied soldiers in the fields of France and the forests of Belgium, the King Tiger was a creature of myth before it was a reality. The Tiger phobia that had gripped armored units after their first encounters with the Tiger I in North Africa and Russia was amplified by intelligence reports and rumors of its even larger successor. It was spoken of in hushed, fearful tones in the mess tents and staging areas. GIs who had survived an encounter would describe its immense size, its long, menacing gun, and the terrifying way their own shells would simply ricochet off its thick hide. Allied armored doctrine, particularly the American approach, was based on mass production and numerical superiority. The M4 Sherman was a good, reliable tank, but it was never designed to go toe-to-toe with a German heavy. A standard 75mm Sherman could not penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armor at any range. Even the more powerful 76mm gun, or the British 17-pounder on the Sherman Firefly, had to be at dangerously close ranges to have a chance. And even then, a shot to the turret or glacis plate was likely to glance off. Confronted with this seemingly invincible foe, Allied tactics had to evolve. The official doctrine became one of avoidance and combined arms. A lone King Tiger could hold up an entire armored column. The standard procedure upon spotting one was not to engage it frontally, but to immediately radio for support. Artillery would be called in, not necessarily to destroy the tank, but to saturate the area with high explosives, hoping to damage its tracks, suspension, or optics, or simply to force the crew to button up, restricting their vision. Infantry would attempt to close in with bazookas or sticky bombs, a suicidal task against a supported tank. The most effective counter was air power. The P-47 Thunderbolt and Hawker Typhoon, with their rockets and armor-piercing cannons, were the bane of all German panzers, and the King Tiger was their #1 target. A pilot who could claim a kill on a King Tiger was a hero. For the average Allied tanker, the strategy was simpler and more brutal: swarm it. While the King Tiger was engaging one Sherman, 2 or 3 others would be racing to get a shot at its weaker side or rear armor. It was a costly, terrifying calculus. It often took the sacrifice of several Allied tanks and their crews to bring down a single King Tiger. The appearance of one on the battlefield fundamentally changed the geometry of the fight, replacing linear advances with a desperate, all-consuming hunt for the monster. The initial hours of the Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944, seemed to validate every myth about the King Tiger. As part of Kampfgruppe Piper, the heavy tanks of Schwer SS Panzer Abteilung 501 smashed through the unprepared American lines. Their 80mm guns barked in the pre-dawn gloom, and American Shermans and M10 tank destroyers, caught completely by surprise, brewed up in flaming pyres, often from ranges of over a kilometer. For Franz Wagner and his crew, the feeling was one of exhilaration. They were invincible. The American shells sparked and glanced off their thick armor as they methodically eliminated any opposition. But as the spearhead pushed deeper into the rugged, wooded terrain, the monster began to reveal its fragile heart. The Ardennes was a tanker's nightmare. The roads were narrow, winding, and often little more than muddy tracks. For a tank nearly 4 meters wide and weighing 70 tons, navigation was a constant struggle. Drivers, often with only a few hours of experience on the new machines, had to perform delicate maneuvers that put immense strain on the already overstressed transmissions and steering systems. The problems began to cascade. One of Piper's lead tanks, trying to negotiate a tight turn in the village of Stavelo, threw a track. The immense multi-ton ribbon of steel lay uselessly in the mud. The tank was now an immovable roadblock. Further down the line, another King Tiger attempting to cross a small stone bridge proved too heavy. The bridge collapsed, sending the tank into the freezing Amblev River and blocking another key route of advance. The most insidious enemy, however, was the fuel gauge. The Maybach engine was phenomenally thirsty, consuming over 800 liters of gasoline for every 100 kilometers of road travel. In the muddy stop-and-go conditions of the Ardennes, consumption was even higher. The offensive's success depended entirely on capturing Allied fuel dumps, but as the advance slowed, the tanks began to run dry. Franz watched his own gauge dip into the red. They were forced to halt, to wait for fuel that was struggling to reach them on the congested, broken roads. The unstoppable momentum of the first few hours bled away, not under the weight of American firepower, but due to the insatiable thirst and mechanical fragility of the very weapons that were supposed to guarantee victory. The iron fist was slowly, agonizingly opening, its fingers cramping up one by one. The King Tiger was not primarily defeated by the enemy. It was defeated by its own internal contradictions. It was a masterpiece of theoretical power, undone by practical reality. The litany of its engineering flaws stands as a stark testament to the limits of the German quality over quantity doctrine in the late war. The overstressed engine. At its heart was the Maybach HL230 P30 V12 engine. This 23-liter gasoline engine, producing 700 horsepower, was a brilliant piece of engineering. However, it was the same power plant used in the 45-ton Panther and the 57-ton Tiger Wine. In the nearly 70-ton King Tiger, it was perpetually operating at or near its maximum output. This chronic overstressing led to a host of problems. Overheating was rampant, causing head gaskets to blow and engine blocks to crack. The complex fuel system was prone to leaks, and the engine bay, packed tight with machinery and fuel lines, was a tinderbox. Many King Tigers were lost not to enemy shells, but to catastrophic engine fires, the fragile transmission. The tank's true Achilles heel was its transmission and final drive. Moving 70 tons of steel requires transmitting immense amounts of torque. The Henschel-designed Olvar semi-automatic transmission was an incredibly complex system of gears and clutches. It was a watchmaker's solution to a blacksmith's problem. Prone to overheating and requiring a delicate, experienced hand to operate, it frequently failed under the strain. The final drives, the gears that transfer power to the drive sprockets, were another critical weak point, often shearing their teeth under the immense load. A failed transmission or final drive rendered the tank completely immobile. Since Germany lacked recovery vehicles powerful enough to tow a 70-ton tank, a mechanical breakdown was often a fatal blow. The crushing weight. Its sheer mass was a logistical and tactical nightmare. It could not cross most European bridges. It was too wide for many tunnels and narrow roads. When it ventured off-road, its high ground pressure, despite its wide tracks, made it susceptible to getting bogged down in soft mud or snow. An immobilized King Tiger was an easy target for artillery or air attack. The simple act of turning the tank in soft ground could cause it to throw a track, a repair job that could take the crew hours or even days in freezing, exposed conditions. Late war production. The King Tigers produced in 1944 and 1945 suffered from declining German manufacturing quality. Allied bombing raids disrupted supply chains, and critical alloys like molybdenum, needed to strengthen steel, were in desperately short supply. As a result, the armor plate, while incredibly thick, was often brittle. A direct hit from a high-velocity shell, even if it didn't penetrate, could cause the armor to crack or spall, sending a deadly shotgun blast of metal fragments flying around the interior of the crew compartment. The unexpected, tragic outcome was that this symbol of German might was often a hollow threat. For every King Tiger knocked out by Allied action, several more were simply abandoned by their crews, out of fuel, its engine seized, or its transmission shattered, and then scuttled with demolition charges to prevent their capture. It was a weapon defeated by its own weight and complexity. The psychological journey of a King Tiger crew was one of extreme highs and devastating lows. The pride of being entrusted with the Reich's most advanced weapon was immense. They were the elite, the Panzer knights in their technological castles. This initial confidence, however, quickly eroded into a constant, gnawing anxiety about the reliability of their machine. The despair of having to abandon a perfectly intact, multi-million Reichsmark tank because of a simple mechanical failure was profound. It was a deep source of shame and frustration. The diaries and letters of heavy tank commanders are filled with bitter complaints about the unreliability of their mounts. They wrote of meticulously planned attacks that collapsed before contact with the enemy because half their tanks had broken down on the approach march. They described the heartbreaking decision to place demolition charges on their own pristine machine and walk away, becoming mere infantrymen in a losing war. This reality had a powerful effect on the Allies as well. As they advanced through France and Belgium, they began to find these abandoned behemoths by the roadside, sometimes with barely a scratch on them, often with a telltale pool of oil underneath or a single broken track. This discovery demystified the monster. It revealed a critical vulnerability that was more reliable than any anti-tank gun. Allied crews learned that the King Tiger, while terrifying in a direct fight, was a brittle giant. Its reputation for invincibility was replaced by a reputation for unreliability. The psychological edge, the terror that the tank was designed to project, began to dissipate. It was still a foe to be respected and feared, but it was no longer seen as an unstoppable force of nature. For the Germans, their greatest symbol of technological strength was becoming a monument to their strategic failure, a brilliant concept that could not overcome the friction and grit of a real war. Of the approximately 492 King Tigers that were produced, their combat record tells a story not of dominance, but of attrition against themselves. While their kill-to-loss ratio in direct tank-on-tank combat was impressive, the overall picture was grim. It is estimated that more King Tigers were lost to mechanical failures, lack of fuel, and abandonment than to all enemy action combined. During the Battle of the Bulge, of the 45 King Tigers assigned to Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 501, only a handful remained operational by the end of the campaign, with the vast majority being abandoned along the line of retreat. The King Tiger stands as the ultimate symbol of Germany's flawed quality over quantity philosophy. While German engineers created a tank that was, in a one-on-one duel, superior to anything the Allies had, they created a weapon that was strategically irrelevant. The war was ultimately won by logistics, mass production, and reliability. The Allies produced over 50,000 Sherman tanks and 80,000 T-34s. These tanks were simpler, cheaper, and far more reliable. They could be repaired in the field with basic tools, and they could traverse bridges and terrain that would stop a King Tiger in its tracks. The war was won by the relentless tide of mechanically sound, easily maintained machines, not by a handful of exquisite but fragile superweapons. The legacy of the King Tiger is a crucial lesson in military history and engineering. It is a textbook example of over-engineering, a design so focused on perfecting certain parameters, armor and firepower, that it sacrifices the more mundane but far more critical aspects of reliability, mobility, and serviceability. It was a weapon designed for a perfect world, for hard-surfaced roads and unlimited fuel, not for the muddy, chaotic, resource-starved reality of the Eastern and Western fronts in 1944. In the end, Lieutenant Franz Wagner's tank, Panzer 213, did not fall to an American shell. Near L'Église, Its transmission finally gave out completely. With the American forces closing in and no hope of recovery, he gave the order he had dreaded. They placed a demolition charge in the turret and another on the engine block. As he and his 4 crewmen trudged away into the Belgian snow, the muffled explosions behind them were the final ignominious verdict on their invincible machine. It was no longer a king. It was just another piece of rusting, abandoned steel, a monument to a dream of technological supremacy that had shattered against the hard realities of war.